Good day, everybody. My name is Thomas Dullien. I used to do a lot of computer security work under the pseudonym of Halvar Flake. I'm a computing mathematician, a mathematician that actually computes something. And the talk today is titled A Walk Down the Learning Curve. 7 years ago, I gave a talk here titled Moore's Law and the Anomaly of Cheap Complexity. And the subject of that talk was how the economics of the semiconductor industry make it so that complex devices are cheaper to build than simple devices in many cases. And I talked about how this shapes the way that we design technology products, and also how this impacts a lot of the cybersecurity problems that we have to face in practice. Today's talk is about the high-tech learning curve when you're manufacturing high-tech goods, and how that economic law impacts national security. So, why am I, a mathematician, speaking at a cybersecurity conference about economics? Well, the issue really is that in market societies, economic incentives and economic laws shape pretty much everything. And if pathologies arise, it is by reshaping and fixing the economic incentives that you fix the pathologies. And one of my experiences in cybersecurity has been that cybersecurity practitioners often have a tendency to ignore the economic incentives and then swim against the current until they're exhausted and burn out. So an important thing to realize is you have to analyze the economic incentives and the laws, and understanding them and shaping them needs to be at the heart of national security strategy and of NATO security strategy. Because the reality is that national security objectives are only very rarely aligned with economic efficiency, and finding a way to align them or finding a way to fix them accordingly is at the heart of solving any of the national security or NATO security problems. The talk is titled Walking Down the Learning Curve, so it is about learning. And in order to learn to do something, you have to do it. And in order to make something, you have to actually make the thing. We tend to forget that you need to make the things in order to get better at making these things. Our educational system is very much biased towards theory, where we think that if we've understood how to make something, we can make the thing. And that is not the case. To illustrate this, there are more nuclear powers than countries that can make a good ballpoint pen tip. That's somewhat counterintuitive. China only acquired the capability to make a high-class ballpoint pen tip in 2008 or 2009 after a large government investment program. High-precision manufacturing requires decades of experience and a lot of investment and practical just data collection and refinement. This is very true in semiconductors. TSMC is the only real provider of cutting-edge semiconductors these days. I am almost certain that the Chinese government has stolen every single document TSMC has ever written. But that does not translate, apparently, into the ability to manufacture cutting-edge chips. People overestimate how easily cyber espionage translates into industrial capacity. You usually do not become a good carpenter by stealing the carpenter's invoices. So, I'm talking about the high-tech learning curve, and the high-tech learning curve means that for high-tech goods, let it be semiconductors, let it be high-end drones, let it be electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries, and even LLMs, all of these things have in common that you need to have a constant investment, a big constant investment in R&D and infrastructure at the same time to continue being able to produce cutting-edge products. And this massive investment needs to be amortized over the number of items that you produce, which leads to a situation where most countries are incapable of producing any of them. And then sometimes you can obtain artisanal production where you have extremely high cost for a very small number of artisanal items that you can produce. And then if you have sufficient volume, you can amortize the cost of all these investments over all this volume, and then you can actually produce large quantities of cutting-edge technology. But it's really volume production that is king here. Volume drives innovation, volume drives the ability to keep investing and keep walking down the learning curve of making things. And this is counterintuitive because in a lot of classical economic theory, you only have one equilibrium in production. And as soon as the slope of these curves inverts in this strange way, you get multiple equilibria, but the equilibrium is nothing, a tiny number of very expensive items, or a large number of reasonably priced items. Intel as a company is really the most evident example of a cautious tale here. Because Intel came to dominate semiconductors and CPUs by obtaining the volume business. x86 got the volume business for IBM PCs. That means Intel could produce lots and lots of chips. And while they're producing all these chips and had high volume manufacturing and revenue, they could invest in their process technology, and they walked down the learning curve to the point where they were about 2 generations ahead of everybody else in semiconductors. And if anybody here remembers the 1990s and early 2000s x86 RISC wars, pretty much everybody agrees that the RISC machines were the better architecture, but Intel managed to compete successfully on an inferior architecture because they were 2 generations ahead in manufacturing. So x86 largely won the entire market by Intel having obtained the volume business ahead of time and then advanced down the learning curve. Now, what is fascinating is that the same mechanism that allowed Intel to gain dominance was then forgotten inside Intel. So by the 2000s, late 2000s, early 2010s, Intel was absolutely dominant in server chips. Companies like Amazon or Google were absolutely at the mercy because nobody else could produce high-performance server chips. And Intel, in its the business decisions at Intel were, hey, we should really focus on the high-margin server business. And when Steve Jobs called to try to get Intel chips into the iPhone, famously Intel decided that the margins on the volume production for mobile phones are so terrible that they're not interested in doing it. So they ceded the volume production to TSMC, that then used the volume production to walk down the learning curve and leapfrog past Intel, to the point where now Intel can no longer compete on process technology, and it is very doubtful whether Intel will survive as an independent company. And this is really, a key insight here. If you assume as a country that you are in a perpetual peaceful environment, that there's not ever going to be any conflict, then it makes sense to focus on higher value-add goods. Because, you can charge more money for them, right? But these higher value-add goods are often more artisanal, more bespoke. Examples for this are creating a brand, or creating of a complex structured financial product, or hand-stitching bespoke leather goods, luxury leather goods, or making luxury automobiles. All of these have much better margins than volume production. And this is good because it allows accumulation of more wealth. The downside is it is very, very difficult to fight a conflict of attrition with hand-stitched luxury handbags. And this is really where economics and security come into tension. Economic efficiency and security and national security clash at this point. If you have to assume an uncertain world where conflict is an actual option, there is no alternative to learning how to make things yourself and walking down the learning curve. And the trouble is that this is economically inefficient for small entities, for small countries. For most high-tech chips, no individual country can produce or have sufficient domestic demand to have a player that is big enough to do the investments. If you look at TSMC's R&D and capital investment, that is bigger than many countries' defense budgets. So it's very, very clear that you can't do this. And the end result of this is, if high-tech goods are important for warfighting, then there can be no sovereignty or security for isolated small countries, because they cannot produce what is required to defend themselves. And it's really only large defensive blocs that can shape the economic incentives in a way that obtains and retains volume production that can have any semblance of sovereignty and security. And the picture here shows that the AI couldn't generate 27 raccoons in a trench coat, so I had to do with 3. So this brings me to what I call the errors of the West. Since World War II, and particularly since the 1990s, the West has behaved as if wars of attrition or any attritional conflict is over. We very much focused on conflicts where it was huge industrial powers against comparatively poorly equipped insurgencies. The idea of having an actual attritional conflict was just gone. And you can see this in a lot of Western military production. It has become increasingly artisanal. On that learning curve, we're to the left. We're at the extremely high cost, small volume production for almost everything when it comes to military technologies. Ever more expensive kit in ever smaller numbers. And this is true not only for military goods, but the entire West has tried to move towards more artisanal goods. Higher value add, lower volume. Better margins, less national security. The result is that the West as a collective is taking the risk of doing the same mistake that Intel did. Ceding volume production to adversaries, or to potential adversaries, and losing the ability to innovate in product and efficiency, and losing the ability to make sovereign decisions. We're really risking the repeat of Intel's mistake, but on a global level, so to speak. And you can see this to some extent with electric vehicles already. Another example is drones in Ukraine. Ukraine is really, like the conflict in Ukraine, the Russian invasion and the result is fascinating from this perspective, because cheap drones that were mass-produced in China initially are really crucial in the entire conflict. Ms. Boyko's talk yesterday was very fascinating in that aspect. And the mind shift is really that a drone, which was previously thought about as a cheap airplane, is really more of an expensive bullet. It's like a consumable. And the question then comes, what is the cost if I had to source a drone that currently is about $500 in, like a simple drone is about $500 all in? What does it cost when I have to source all my components from blue list countries? And I challenge you to find a manufacturer of cheap and cheerful electric motors anywhere in Europe. I can find very high-end electric motors that will last without maintenance for ages at a premium. I cannot find a cheap electric motor anywhere in Europe. That industry isn't there anymore. So by the time that you've managed to build a drone out of blue list country parts, it has gotten so expensive you may as well put a Louis Vuitton logo on it. All right? So the issue really is that for consumables or for many goods, you need to be able to also produce the low-end version. If you can only produce the high-end version, you can't produce volume, and that's a real problem. How does all of this tie back to cybersecurity? Software has already eaten the world and is now eating the battlefield. I referred to yesterday's talk again by Ms. Boyko, which was very impressive in showing how software is reshaping the battlefield in Ukraine. And you can see this in the currently, or the new UK military strategy, where they talk about 80% unmanned systems. Software will battle software, and unmanned to unmanned combat will become a large feature of the battlefield. Which is interesting in the sense that energy efficiency and speed of compute is going to be a major constraint for all these systems. Energy is probably the ultimate constraint for autonomous systems in the sense that the autonomous system needs to carry all its energy with it, and then it can decide to spend it on things like propulsion or on things like signal processing and reasoning and AI and whatsoever. Which means that a smarter drone will almost inevitably have lesser range than an equivalent dumber drone, because you're going to use some energy for doing all the compute. And the speed of your OODA loop in machine-to-machine combat will depend crucially on your processing speed on the device and on the latency in decision-making and so forth. This is going to be very interesting because one of my pet peeves with security, cybersecurity in particular, has been that quite often as a cybersecurity practitioner, you don't understand the economic impact of some of the security measures. The first half of my career was security, and then I had about a 7-year stretch of doing efficiency work. And there are many situations where a security practitioner proposes a security mitigation that costs like 8 to 10% of performance, thinking that this is a reasonable thing to do, and then meeting electrical engineers that have just spent 3 years trying to get 0.5% performance out of a chip. So the cost of security mitigations And the cost of implementing security is going to become very evident in these systems because it will lead to reduced capability. You will literally have a trade-off. Do I want to fly further, or do I want to do more compute and more validation of things? Anyhow, summarizing what I want to say, there's about 3 takeaway points. The first takeaway point is giving up volume production is, in the short run, economically more efficient, assuming no conflict, but it jeopardizes national security in the medium run. And you need to be part of a large economic defensive bloc that can retain volume production if you want to have any sovereignty in the future. Which brings me to the second point, the split that we have, particularly in Europe, where trade and economics is something you do in Brussels, and then defense is something NATO does. The split between EU and NATO is very, very harmful. Trade policy is national security policy. National security policy needs to take trade policy into account. And there needs to be much more dialogue between the two. And that entire thing needs to be integrated in some form. And then the last point is, as we're moving into autonomous systems everywhere, cybersecurity will broaden to encompass all of this stuff again. Spectrum dominance, machine-to-machine combat, trying to get autonomous systems to make poor decisions, trying to get autonomous systems to spend resources inefficiently. All of that will enter the picture and will be part of cybersecurity. Which brings me to the next point, which is, as software is eating the world, or has eaten the world, and is eating the battlefield, as everything becomes a connected device, and we sprinkle chips into things like we put salt on food, cybersecurity will become so broad as to be almost meaningless. And then the question becomes, is it really still cybersecurity, or is it just security? Because there's nothing that doesn't involve cyber. Anyhow, that's the last slide. And I think we're now moving on to a Q&A with the gentlemen hackers.
Well, good morning, CCD COE. We are the Gentlemen Hackers. My name is Mikko Hyppönen, and this is Tomi Tuominen.
Happy to see you all here.
The Gentlemen Hackers is a podcast which we've been running with Tomi for the last 5 years, and it is by far the most popular technology podcast in Finland. So we both come across the Baltic Sea from Finland, and as a proud citizen of Finland, the first thing I'd like to do is to thank for having us as a member of NATO. We promise to do our part. Welcome. And the topic of today will be to chat with Thomas about the state of the world.
We're super happy to have you here. Thank you for agreeing to join us on stage. Maybe you would go first.
Well, you brought up several interesting points. Let's just start from the fact that 10 years ago, if somebody would have told us that there's going to be a war in Europe, we're going to lose a country from EU, we will have United States more divided than ever before in history, there's going to be a pandemic which shuts down the whole world, all of that would have sounded like science fiction. So clearly, the world is in a very turbulent state. And one of the themes in your keynote was that national security objectives rarely align with economic efficiency. Why is that?
Well, so market economies are very good at maximizing for efficiency, but efficiency is not always resilience, right? My long and complicated supply chain works great in terms of producing the cheapest good and is very efficient, but then the smallest disruption to the supply chain creates a situation where I don't have my good anymore. So clearly, the economically efficient thing to do is nobody ever has any conflict. Everybody can just trade. People specialize on certain things, and there's never any disruption. But we've seen, both with the pandemic, where Europe out of a sudden couldn't produce masks anymore, and so forth, and then with the heightened geopolitical tensions, that there's different objectives, like markets optimize for maximum efficiency, but not for resilience when things start shaking. And national security is clearly about resilience when things are shaking. So this is where a fundamental tension comes from. If you try to optimize any mechanical part just for weight and cost, you can't optimize it at the same time for resilience under all possible forms.
So,
forces.
Are you against outsourcing basic production of all kinds? Is it always a bad idea?
So I mentioned that you need to be part of a large economic and defensive bloc that retains volume production. I think outsourcing all production outside of your larger bloc is a bad idea. Then the question can become, can I enlarge my bloc so somebody that can produce the things as a reasonable at a reasonable cost is part of my bloc? But to some extent, China has run a very, very successful strategy of attracting production, and almost everybody has pooled all their manufacturing in China. And that's a very concentrated risk. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't outsource production, but the economic and defensive bloc that you're part of needs to be large enough to support production within that bloc, if that makes any sense. And once you have some production, you can have also outsourced to the other side, because what you see in these high-tech markets is you often see the emergence of duopolies. You see two players that can provide the highest end good, because one player gets lazy, and then two players both have enough volume to support the investment and keep each other on each toe. So as an example, let's imagine India was tied into, for a second, the larger NATO bloc for a second, and we could do a lot of the production for some of the goods we currently source from China and India. Then out of a sudden you have one producer inside of your bloc, and you can outsource some to the other because you don't lose volume production ability entirely from your bloc.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
You just get the economic benefits, but you still maintain the capability of producing it yourself as well.
Yeah. I should mention, though, I'm on thin ice here. I'm not an economist. If you want to talk economics, my brother is the economist in the family. I'm the mathematician.
Speaking of economics, you also mentioned that defense and trade policies are rarely aligned. Based on my experience in Finland, every time when you mention something like that, there's a question of, okay, who should lead this? And taking that into the EU context, it becomes even more complicated. What do you suggest? How should we do this?
I wish I knew. What I do know is that Europe has a very stark choice, and that has been evident for like 15 years, but it's becoming impossible to ignore no matter how much we try to ignore it. Europe has the choice of becoming a nice tourist destination that sells delicacies to Chinese and American tourists, or to stop being so fragmented. So some form of cohesion needs to emerge. Europe has also been very good at snatching defeat from the jaws of victory for as long as I've been alive. So I don't think I can tell you who should lead or do this.
Many of the European success stories are actually prime examples of this. Look at Swiss watchmaking. When quartz watches were invented in 1970s, you would think that mechanical watches that you wind would completely die out. They've actually increased their business like 100-fold since then, because they became luxury items. But that's not really helpful in the context of what we're speaking about here. So I would agree with what you're saying about that Europe is basically becoming a museum.
There's a real risk. I think I have it on my slides somewhere where I say there's a risk that Europe becomes the main provider of luxury versions of legacy goods. If you look at, particularly for military purposes, high-precision metal machining is very, very important. And Europe is still very good at that. If you look at a video from a Russian arms factory, pretty much all the machines are made by European manufacturers. But how did Europe get to that point? Largely by having a large automobile industry. The internal combustion engine supports a lot of the high-precision manufacturing. The watch industry is very high-precision, clearly. The risk is now electric vehicles are taking over. It's very clear that the internal combustion engine is a legacy technology, at least for personal propulsion. And then the question is, will we be able to maintain excellence in metal machining if that big customer goes away? Will we be able to build excellence in electric vehicles if we don't have volume production? Yes, there is a real risk that if you only specialize on the luxury goods, you lose the ability to innovate on, on anything really.
I'll make another point about the fine watches industry of Switzerland. Some of the cutting-edge watches being made in Switzerland nowadays actually use ultraviolet lithography as part of the production of mechanical watches. And this is the same technology we use to build CPUs and GPUs. So I have a link here to Europe, the topic at hand, which is that one of the areas where we still do have cutting edge technology would be ASML.
Yes.
And how they still seem to be untouchable or uncatchable by competitors in the same way as TSMC is in Taiwan. Why is it so hard to catch companies like ASML and TSMC in what they do?
Well, so for TSMC, you need to be able to invest the right amount of money in the R&D to learn how to do it, and you need the constant feedback from production. And ASML is similar. I mean, ASML, there's a crazy story about the ASML leadership more or less deciding to invest multiple billions into making EUV technology work, when everybody else in the industry is like, this will never work. So they somehow manage to maintain a level of investment that is very difficult to emulate, and they have the constant feedback from production. It's going to be a really fascinating experiment if you look at what's happening in China at the moment. Because Intel tried to make chip making without EUV technology work, and they couldn't do so at sufficient yields. So they couldn't produce enough high-end chips using that methodology, and finally they had to accept, okay, EUV is the way to go. We're now prohibiting China from buying ASML optical machines. And the big question is, will this lead to China just lagging perpetually? Or will this lead to the emergence of some form of technology in China that manages to achieve the same result by different means? And I mean, from a purely experimental technologist perspective, you very rarely get to experiment with progress in that manner. You have an arc of progress, and once everybody agrees on this is the right technology, you go that way. And now we're forcing a very large economy away from the path that everybody has chosen. So it's fascinating to see it play out, and it'll be fascinating to see what happens there. Long story short, why is it hard to catch the leader? The leader gets a lot of money to invest and a lot of data from the manufacturing process. And unless you're manufacturing at volume and investing at volume, you don't get the same feedback. So it's very, very hard to catch up.
The leader also has to be bold enough to invest a major part of their profits into R&D, and that's what ASML and TSMC have been doing for decades.
This is a fascinating conundrum. If you look at the semiconductor industry, it has many choke points where an individual provider is almost a monopolist for what they're providing, yet none of them seem to have pricing power. Meaning, like from a stock market perspective, all the companies in the supply chain for semiconductors are bad investments because they have poor margins in spite of being almost monopolies.
Right.
Which I guess is partially because you need to have these massive R&D investments, and it's a strange market for sure.
In your talk, you also mentioned that future wars will be basically done between machines. And obviously now we have all seen in Ukraine that seems to be the case, at least with drones. what do you think is going to happen? Some sort of like Transformers type of thing, or like what kind of machines are we going to see?
So there's really, really interesting engineering trade-offs when you look at autonomous systems. If you look at the drone warfare at the moment, the major defense against drones at the moment is electronic warfare or electric warfare, like closing the spectrum, making sure that nobody can communicate with the drone. And if you succeed in doing so, then the drone cannot be remotely controlled, and then things are good. So it's clear from an attacker perspective that you want more autonomy inside of the drone. But this autonomy comes at a cost in terms of energy consumption, weight, and so forth. And one example that I've heard people talk about is a lot of the anti-drone netting on vehicles is pretty improvised. So it's kind of unique per vehicle, more or less. So
think about the physical nets.
The physical nets that have been put over the vehicle. So building an autonomous drone, like you can buy a DJI sports drone now that can follow a mountain bike rider through a forest without hitting branches. So the problem of just following a target and then not losing track of it and hitting it, that's a solved problem. That's easy. So why are you not seeing stuff like this mass deployed in anti-vehicle drones? Well, part of the reason is that you still need a pilot at the moment to look at the actual image of the vehicle with all the improvised nets on top, and then find a good way to hit the part of the vehicle which is exposed. So there's a puzzle-solving aspect to it. And while the problem of just following something is solved, the problem of solving a puzzle, you may have, like, perhaps ChatGPT 04 or whatever can do it, but you don't have that compute on the edge. And you particularly don't have that compute on the edge if the spectrum is closed, right? Because then your edge device cannot talk to the data center. So
you can't have an H200 on the drone.
You can't have an H200 on the drone for cost reasons and for power reasons. It's very, very expensive to have a lot of compute on the drone, and it eats a lot of power to do the compute on the drone. And so now you're in this strange regime where if you go into a contested environment where the spectrum is heavily contested, you will need to have edge devices that have some smarts because they need to make independent decisions, but then you don't have the compute and you don't have the cost advantage of the drone anymore. So the engineering nerd in me just finds all of that very, very fascinating. Also the fact that we've essentially, like, it's a very strange form of capture if you think about it, like having a vehicle with improvised netting and then a human needs to solve the puzzle in order to hit it.
So it's basically a Turing test.
A sort of Turing test, yes. Kinetic.
Now, in the excellent talk yesterday evening from Lieutenant Colonel Boyko, we heard about gamification in actual use in the war in Ukraine, where troops are getting points for finishing missions, and then they can cash in those points by getting access to more equipment. How do you feel about this?
Well, I mean, it makes sense. As a bit of an anecdote, I used to run a computer security company doing reverse engineering tooling in the mid-2000s. And we used to have a sort of game at lunch where we would try to come up with new DARPA projects which had to be both scientifically implausible and ethically dubious. So one of the things we came up with at one point was we had read an article about drone pilots requiring psychological counseling because it was very hard on them to drone pilot during the day and then go home to their families at night during the war on terror. And we were then proposing, hey, why do the pilots even have to see the humans? Why can't we just cartoon render Goofy over them? And then if you go that way, why do you need a military pilot anyhow and just put up an arcade somewhere where people pay coins in order to...
Basically crowdsource the killing.
Crowdsource it. Now that was very funny at the time.
And ethically dubious like you wanted.
Oh yeah, clearly. But it goes to show you should be very, very careful about the comedy that you come up with. Right. It seems to shape reality.
Yeah. Yes.
nowadays it seems very hard to distinguish comedy from real life anyway, so we're on track. You also mentioned that the field of cybersecurity will broaden further to defend against autonomous systems. Could you elaborate that a bit?
Well, I mean, when I started cybersecurity, you had computers, as in servers, as in big chunky boxes sitting somewhere, and that was cybersecurity. And nowadays, my cell phone charger has 2 ARM cores at every end in every plug. So everything, like there's internet-connected toothbrushes, everything has a cyber component, so the scope of cyber has expanded massively. And I see this myself because I'm ostensibly a security expert, and I cannot track anymore all the different subfields of cybersecurity. So cybersecurity as a field has expanded and expanded and expanded and expanded. But the question becomes, if everything has a cyber component, is there still such a thing as cybersecurity, or does it all become security? Because now, if you have autonomous systems, you have a merging between the physical security and cybersecurity and spectrum warfare. So there's really, like, saying I do cybersecurity doesn't say much about you anymore, because it can be pretty much anything, because everything is cyber related.
Good point.
Yeah, that's the way I've slowly realized over the years how our job has changed. Because when I started doing malware reverse engineering in 1991, the world was very simple, and I was a computer security guy. For decades, I thought that my job as a computer security guy is to secure computers. Computer security people secure computers. That's the way I thought about it. But of course, if you open your eyes today and look around, we all realize very quickly that our societies, everything runs on top of computers and computer networks, which really means that computer security people don't secure computers. Computer security people secure the society. And the responsibility shift and change has been so slow, we haven't even realized it. But it's a pretty big responsibility to be put on a bunch of geeks and nerds. But that's basically what we've done.
I mean, in one of the talks yesterday, there was a discussion. I forgot the name of the person from CertUA that presented, but he presented about an attacker group that's specialized on notary services. So just think about this, where we have attacker groups that specialize on essentially doing denial of service on a key infrastructure for business transactions. In 2000, I had friends that were running large DDoS networks. I had no idea that this would become what it has become. The other thing I find fascinating is how the youth culture of 1990s IRC is something that is emulated in the slang of intelligence agencies, as we've seen in the Snowden leaks, or intelligence agencies pretending, like with good cipher, to essentially be 1990s kids. So sometimes I think about this as if you're part of a youth culture, a competitive youth culture, let's say breakdance, and then all the nations in the world decide, for international conflict, we really need breakdancers. So it's very bizarre to see how the small, reasonably isolated youth culture and all its norms have seeped into broader society and into international conflict. It's
LOL.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, the thing about denial of service attacks or distributed denial of service attacks against notary services is a great example on how we have two kinds of infrastructure, or two types of critical infrastructure, the kind which is online and which can be attacked with the traffic jams of the internet, aka denial of service attacks, and then the kind of infrastructure which cannot. There's plenty of examples of offline critical infrastructure, like nuclear power plants and things like that. But we have a surprisingly large amount of our critical infrastructure online which can be attacked. For example, online banks. Online banks have to be online because they're online banks, and we don't have any alternative of doing finance for consumers anymore. And of course, if they're online, they can always be attacked with denial of service attacks. So this is a hard problem to solve. Technology is great, but it does expose us to completely new kinds of risks and completely new kinds of crime. That's exactly what happens.
Let's maybe talk about more positive things. On your, you've been around for quite some time. What is the most groundbreaking thing that, if you think about technological revolutions that you have seen so far? What is the thing that you're most excited about?
It's a bit of a complicated question, and it's not going to be terribly original. So the thing that's fascinating about technological change is there's a joke about bankruptcy, that you go bankrupt very, very gradually and then all at once. And with technological change, it's very similar, where the change is very gradual until it is very sudden. When GPUs came to be in order to accelerate games, it was interesting to see that parallel compute plays a role. I have a fascinating book called A New Paradigm in Computation from 1993 that talks about how the new paradigm in computing is now parallel, and this will change everything. In 1993. And they're, the authors, eminent mathematicians and computer scientists, amongst them Nick Mitropoulos, who worked on the Manhattan Project, and so forth. They all say, okay, the time is now, parallel compute is here, it'll change everything. And then the reality is that nothing happened. GPUs come out in, 96, 97? Nothing happens.
Gaming got faster.
Gaming got faster. Nothing relevant, for me, nothing relevant happened. I still play Doom.
There you go.
But we can run Doom on washing machines.
That I can do. But either way, raycasting is not as parallel as 3D rendering. But nothing happens, nothing happens, nothing happens. Early 2000s, I'm studying mathematics, sitting in computer science lectures about machine learning, where people tell me all this neural network stuff is bullshit. 2005. You should use support vector machines for everything. Neural networks are an abysmal failure. 2006 and 2007, people start realizing that sometimes a neural network can, in fact, do something. 2011, 12, Google tries to train large neural networks on CPUs. 2013, 14, some grad students at Stanford realize that they can reproduce what Google is doing on thousands of CPUs on 3 GPUs. And out of a sudden, we have an algorithm that allows us to make use of all the parallelism that we have, but that we couldn't use beforehand because parallel computing is actually hard. And now this massive amount of computing becomes available, and weirdly enough, we're in this flywheel where the models become better, we throw more compute at them, they become better, we make them bigger, we throw more compute at them, and out of a sudden we have LLMs with which I can have a reasonable discussion about some mathematical topic that I don't understand very well. They're not without flaw, but the rate of improvement is very, very high. So when it comes to the question of what's the most impactful technological change, seeing that a single algorithm, which is matrix multiplication iterated with a Hadamard product, which is element-wise multiplication of matrices, can do everything that it does. And we can do that in parallel at a very high speed. That is very fascinating to me. I'm fascinated by the rate of progress that we have around AI. And as I told you before I went on this monologue that the answer is not going to be very original. So because the answer is not original, I'm fascinated by AI and parallel compute. I had to add all this history to it, because otherwise the answer is not interesting.
All right, let me ask you this. We waited for the AI revolution for decades. It happened. Eventually it happened. We're very close to what we were promised already in the 1960s and 70s. We pretty much have that. We have the Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy in our pockets today, basically. That's what happened. Another promise that's been in the making for decades is quantum. What's your best guess on this? Is that going to happen during our lifetime as well?
Okay. I said earlier I'm not an economist. I'm much less of a physicist even. Right? Because my brother is an economist, so I've spoken to economists before and think I've understood some things. My understanding of physics is I went to a humanistisches Gymnasium, like a language-oriented traditional German high school, where the natural sciences were not a thing. My understanding of physics is roughly 8th to 9th grade. So, the only thing I do know is that ever since I work in computer security, people have told me, you need to know and understand quantum. In 3 years, everything is going to be quantum. And that's been the same thing for 25 years. Mm-hmm. In a similar vein, fusion technology. Mm-hmm. So for me, with my understanding of physics, both quantum and fusion are technologies that may or may not happen. And I kind of rely on the assumption that it'll become evident to me at some point that it will happen, and then I'll bother with them. Largely because I'm very skeptical. So I think it is imaginable that we'll be able to factor 2048-bit RSA in my lifetime, perhaps using a quantum computer. But right now, we factored 15. Like, we have factored 15 with a quantum computer. Factoring the next greater product has failed. Right? We haven't factored any number above 64 yet. I think I'll pay attention to quantum when we start factoring numbers beyond 64.
Right. And that gets us back into discussing about cybersecurity. The first CyCon was in 2009. I was here. I spoke in 2009, and the world was quite different. Cybersecurity world was quite different. In 2009, we were discussing about the fact that governments and countries and intelligence agencies are actually doing espionage and spying with cyber tools. Oh my God. But cyber sabotage and cyber war wasn't really a thing. If you think about the last 20 years or so, what's been, in your opinion, the biggest changes in cybersecurity, both on the offense side, but also on the defense side?
So on the offensive side, it's just been a process of continued evolution and specialization. If you look at the history of manned flight, between the first airplane and then 20, 25 years later, 30 years later, you have an explosion in complexity and sophistication around the construction of airframes and so forth. And you see that a little bit with exploit construction. I remember the days when you could turn around a bug in a day and have an exploit the next day. My first job in cybersecurity was somebody posted a bug and I told them I can write you an exploit in a day, and they paid me money for it. Nowadays you have people that are specialized in a specific allocator, in a specific application, turning around a small part of an exploit chain. So on the offensive side, there has been no revolutionary development really in the time that I've been following it. It's just been a continued specialization and adding more sophistication to the attacks. It's going to be very interesting to see whether part of this are going to be changed by LLMs, because LLMs they can do some things that were very difficult to do in the past that are part of the process. It's kind of fascinating. Offensive work is still dominated by individuals with a text editor. There is, you do fuzzing and so forth, and that has been scaled, but by and large, the technology has not changed a huge amount in the last 25 years. Smart people in a room with a text editor and a lot of caffeine. So it's going to be interesting to see how that changes. On the defensive side, I think the emergence of a programming language that is both memory safe and reasonably performant, Rust, is a pretty big deal. Because for many real-time applications, which includes pretty much everything regarding autonomous systems, previous memory-safe languages that relied on garbage collection were not a viable technological choice for a variety of reasons. Rust is a viable technological choice that makes it much more difficult to corrupt memory, and it can eliminate a whole group of vulnerabilities. So I think the emergence of a mainstream language that gets some industry adoption, that eliminates, or can, under proper preconditions, eliminate a number of memory corruption issues, is a pretty big deal. Let me think for a second whether there's another thing on the defensive side. I think the much more ubiquitous deployment of non-bearer tokens, meaning two-factor authentication of some form, that is a very, very big deal as well. If you think about it, bearer tokens, like I joined Google for 2011 as a reaction, like Google acquired us as a reaction to the Aurora attacks, and getting rid of bearer tokens was a huge effort from day one. And we can now see what happened in Google in 2011, essentially getting rid of bearer tokens is something that is more and more adopted all over the industry. I was in an event recently where the president of the German BSI advocated for the use of passkeys to a bunch of, to an audience of regular businesses. So that's a pretty major change from an attacker's perspective. Things get much harder if I can't reuse your password.
It's about time for passwords to die, and it seems it might actually be happening now with passkeys.
I would hope so.
I think we all do hope so.
I mean, we get an interesting tension here because on the one hand side, we're getting much better at tying authentication to actual identity verification with passkeys. At the same time, with the rise of more AI, we will need to delegate some of our abilities to an agent, right? So on the one hand side, we're getting much better at establishing identities, so we're getting rid of bearer tokens here. On the other hand, I'm now I will be in a position where I want an AI agent to make a travel booking for me. So I need to be able to delegate again. So this is going to be an interesting technological challenge. How do I delegate parts of the authority vested in my identity temporarily to another program that can then use it? And how are attackers going to abuse this? And we see this with, like there was a silly vulnerability published yesterday or the day before, where somebody showed that they can trick an AI that has access to multiple code repositories into disclosing paths from the private repository. And that's a classical example. You've delegated some of your access credentials to the AI so it can do something, and now somebody manages to get the AI to do something it shouldn't be doing.
You obviously have a lot of experience about exploit development and that kind of stuff. I'm curious to hear your opinion. Like just lately, a good friend of yours, Sean Heelan, found a Linux kernel bug using LLMs. Also, a few weeks ago, there was a guy who basically took an OpenSSH patch, or SSH server patch, and just asked the LLM to compare the GitHub diffs and make sure that the LLM is capable of creating an exploit automatically, and on top of that, documenting the whole process, actually making a blog post about it. What do you think is going to happen? Like, are we done with the artisanal exploit development work, or will this only work for super simple cases and still the hardcore stuff will be manual?
So this is a really interesting topic. For background, Sean and me used to run a company together, specialized on efficient compute. And prior to that, Sean and me discussed a lot when Sean was writing his PhD thesis on automated heap layout manipulation for offensive work. So I followed Sean's work on LLMs very closely. The thing that happened there is that up until very recently, none of the LLMs were any use in auditing code. They were just terrible at, like they would confidently declare things that were just not true. There was no evidence of reasonable reasoning about what's happening. The recent reasoning models have gotten better, and Sean has had interesting successes. To put them into perspective, the model out of 100 sample runs detected the bug in 8 of 100 runs. So it was a human, like 8% is a reasonable hit rate. The other models didn't find anything, or just once or so. But that is a hit rate where it becomes more than pure noise, so a human auditor still has some benefit from it. And I think this is what Sean's blog post is all about. Hey folks, we're reaching the point where none of this is fully automated yet, but we're reaching the point where using an LLM is no longer guaranteed to be an absolute waste of time, which means it's early, but we're on a trajectory of improvement that is very impressive. It's very, very, very interesting to see. And I think largely this is due to the fact that reasoning models do some form of, in the widest sense of the word, in-context reinforcement learning. Like they spend a lot of compute on reasoning about stuff. So that's fascinating to watch, and I think there is a lot of potential for LLMs to help in finding bugs or in writing better software. If you look at the development process for verified software, usually your proof of correctness is almost as long as the software, if not longer, and there's a lot of cost in annotating your software, or when you're writing Rust, there's a lot of cost in doing the proper memory management and lifetime management of everything. But these are things that an LLM can help with, in the sense that it can help me prove properties about code, because a lot of the proving is drudgery work that in the past couldn't be automated because we didn't have automated proof generators, but nowadays LLMs can do some amount of simple proving. So there is a lot of potential for LLMs to have an impact on source code auditing, also on source code verification, and also they already have an impact on software development. So that's the one side of it. On the exploitation side, if you look closely at that particular bug, it's a logic bug in an Erlang SSH implementation where you can send commands to the server before being fully authenticated. So the exploit is much less an exploit in the sense where you're manipulating memory layouts. It's much more, I just need to implement an SSH client that does things out of order. So it's more like exploitation in that particular case is more a classical software development problem. And we know that LLMs are not good at large-scale software development, but they're pretty good at creating one-shot tools. So I use them a lot for data visualization. If I have a bunch of data that I need to visualize in a certain manner, I hardly ever write the code to do it myself anymore. I ask the LLM, can you please write this? And if it's a one-shot tool, it works well. So for this particular case, the exploit was a software development task. Can you please write something that does things out of order? And then it worked very well. I think for actual exploitation, one of the bottlenecks is going to be that we don't have a lot of training data. Like hardly any exploit developer ever produces a detailed reasoning trace through everything that he does. And a lot of the improvement in recent LLMs for mathematics reasoning came from giving the LLMs very detailed human-created reasoning traces. How does a human reason about this problem? So one of the interesting things to perhaps spend time on is there's a fascinating paper where they could induce mathematical reasoning in a model with just 1,000 examples. Now, 1,000 examples is something that you may be able to generate for certain code analysis tasks by hand. So you need a human that, or you need a group of humans that for 1,000 examples reason carefully in writing, in language, through their entire process of looking at a piece of code. It would be very interesting to see what an LLM can do then. But for exploitation, we almost have no training data that goes beyond perhaps a write-up for a CTF problem.
I have a follow-up question here, but I just want to mention to the audience that we'll take a couple of questions from the audience in just a moment, so you can start thinking about tricky questions to any of us. I think we have to emphasize here when we speak about generative AI and large language models and exploit generation or vulnerability discovery, that this is brand new. Like all of the known vulnerabilities found by these kind of systems have been found during the last 12 months. A year ago, we had zero days discovered by these things, and now there's close to 20. However, all that we know of are discovered by people like Sean or by companies like Google or Crossbow or independent bug bounty researchers. We're not aware of bad guys doing this yet, or if they're doing it, we haven't discovered it. But clearly, if Sean can do it, or if Atte in Oulu can do it with DeepSeek open source system on his own home computer, clearly the criminals can do it as well. Would you agree?
So I think the criminals currently get more bang for the buck by using these systems elsewhere. The creation of simple build once, discard once malware has gotten much cheaper. If I don't need to maintain things, like I can build a lot of throwaway tools very cheaply, and for a lot of offensive tasks, that's fine.
Right.
And that's more useful almost than having it help me generate an attack. Phishing has been revolutionized.
Now it works in all languages.
It works in all languages. I can have long conversations over WhatsApp with somebody pretending to arrange for a date before I send the phishing part. I mean, Instagram bots have gotten fantastically convincing.
Yeah.
So while I agree that this can be used by criminals, if I'm a criminal, I find that vulndev is not the place where I get the most bang for my investment.
We all hope you're right. With that, let's see if we have any questions from the audience. We have a roving mic, and let's see. Well, we have Max Smeets here in the front row. Come and get the microphone here in the front row on my left. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomas, for this really fascinating talk again. I would love if you could extend your argument from, we need scale that leads to learning curves and learning by doing, to, again, offensive cyber operations. When we look here in the room at the NATO members, the great majority have now set up a cyber command, but the great minority have actually conducted cyber effect operations within their cyber command, especially doing so on a repeated basis. Now, we may all participate and lock shields, but there seems to be relatively little learning by doing because we want to do only this doing in wartime. To what degree does this change the incentive scheme entirely for so many people in the room here? To what degree does it mean we have to move to a much more active strategy that we might see coming out of the US? To what degree does it mean that as we can never scale, we can never really learn, and the reality is that most of the cyber commands today will forever be lame ducks, even if they want to effectively operate when the need arises?
It's a really interesting question in terms of, for artillery, I can have a shooting range. For a lot of traditional combat operations, I can practice very similar to what I expect the operation to be. And this is clearly not so feasible for a lot of cyber things. Like just replicating even a corporate network, a large corporate network for training purposes, like train an offensive team at penetrating an offensive corporate network, is extremely hard, and it's some form of unsolved problem. So I don't think I have a good answer for how to do this, especially on a country level. For a cyber command, creating cyber effects, that's you need to simulate something that I don't understand in any way. I think that perhaps you will possibly be able to simulate a corporate network reasonably soon. We've got infrastructure as code, we've got Terraform, whatever. Perhaps you can eventually train an LLM to generate a plausible-looking textual description of a corporate network and then spin up the virtual machines to populate it. I think you're putting a finger on a real problem, which is how on earth do you train as you're going to fight? And perhaps you won't. I think there's a reason why the room was packed yesterday when lessons from Ukraine were discussed, because nothing beats real-world experience. And I guess, I have no answer, yes. If that makes any sense.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question here. Thank you.
Is it work? Yeah, thank you very much. This question will be for Thomas, and I can only echo this was fascinating presentation, and thank you for coming here and presenting. My question is about this artisanal versus volume curve. There seems to be some examples, some niches where actually quality can overcome quantity. Like, for example, when we think about World War II fighter, there is probably no amount of World War II fighters that could shoot down a modern jet fighter. Jet fighter can run out of ammo, but then fly away. And similarly, when you talk about ASML, seems they made the risk to make these artisanal devices. I don't know the numbers, but probably they are not pumping out tens of thousands lithography machines every month. And this still provides edge that West, let's say, has. So it seems that there can be a risk, but also reward in those artisanal projects. So would you say there are some niches, industry sectors that could benefit from not following that volume angle?
So I think it is true that the excellence is necessary as well. Excellence tends to result from volume first. If you look at the rise of Japan, the industrial rise of Japan, a lot of the industries that Japan excels at now are industries where they first went into volume production and then iterated to excellence in volume production. And then once you've reached excellence, you can maintain that for a while. But volume production, I think, is a necessary ingredient to get to excellence. And if you give up volume production, you risk, like, it's easy to go from artisanal excellence to nothing. And you will not easily, like, it's very difficult to go from artisanal excellence to mass production as well. Whereas the path from mass production to excellence has empirically been there for Japan, for South Korea, for pretty much any country that did a late industrialization. China is another example. It's going to be fascinating to see what India will do. But it is true that once you are excellent, if there is sufficient demand to maintain your leadership there, and the ability to produce the artisanal expensive devices, you can keep that. And it is also true that excellence can beat, like your example of fighter planes is correct. Like no amount of World War II fighters will shoot down an F-35 most likely. At the same time, if you're producing a large number of World War II fighters, eventually you will walk up the learning curve and get a better fighter. Yeah. I mean, nothing is easy and clear-cut there, for sure. The big worry I personally have is not so much around established industries where excellence has been achieved. It is around technologies such as EVs and EV batteries and so forth, where we haven't achieved excellence, and also we've not managed volume. So without having volume, we won't achieve excellence. And it's similar in some areas of data processing. Like Europe does not have a cloud provider of equivalent technical sophistication to the American hyperscalers, largely because Europe has never had sufficient volume in data processing to justify the investments there. And we have the same issue, where we cannot move up to excellence because we don't have the volume.
Thank you very much. Once again.
And thank you, Thomas, for giving us plenty of food for thought, which we will need because next up we have lunch coming up as well. With that, we are the Gentlemen Hackers. He's Thomas Dullien. Thank you very much.
Thank you.